Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome to Adventures in History. Today's topic is Zachary Taylor, Part 2, Mexican War Hero. We stopped last time in 1846, and the Mexican War was on. And the early fighting was in northeastern Mexico and in Texas. And Zachary Taylor was the top general early in the war in the Northeast. And one of his challenges, he had 8,000 volunteers whom he needed to supply, and they were untrained and unruly. Also, another challenge, his only instructions he had received from Washington was, quote, "You will not remain completely on the defensive." Very vague. So his plan was to cross the Rio Grande, occupy Matamoros, and then Monterrey in Mexico. One of the problems they had was lack of water. Matamoros was taken without a fight. Now, one of the wonderful things Zach Taylor did, he was very kind to the Mexican people. Again, he'd given that order, and they were treated well. It was a war against the Mexican military, not the civilians. So he treated Mexican people very well and demanded that from his troops. On August 4th of 1846, he marched to Camargo in Mexico, spent a month there. It was a very unhealthy situation, and 1/8 of the army died of disease during the war. The U.S. Army included the 2nd Regiment of Texas Mounted Volunteers, also known as the Texas Rangers, for whom the Texas Rangers baseball team was years later named after. And they were very undisciplined, so not easy for him to handle these fellows. And now they got relief when they left the mud and heat of the Rio Grande Valley and arrived in the Nuevo Leon Highlands. Yeah, in the valley it was hot and the guys were getting sick, and also probably dirty drinking water. Anyway, they arrived in the Nuevo Leon Highlands where it was there was cool, clean air and it was healthier, so that was good. By September, they were in Monterrey, and they were headed toward Monterrey, and a bloody battle was expected. Monterrey was taken, and there was a truce for 8 weeks, and the Mexicans were allowed to leave. Now, during this time, Santa Fe was taken by General Stephen Kearny, and the plan at this point was for General Winfield Scott to take Veracruz in the south and then Mexico City. Now, there was some talk already about Taylor becoming president, and he said, quote, "I will not say I would not serve if the good people were imprudent enough to elect me." Again, August of 46, Stephen Kearny and the U.S. Army reached Santa Fe, and then they pushed on to San Diego. In January of 1847, the U.S. Army defeated the Mexicans at Los Angeles, California. February of 47, General Taylor was in Agua Nueva and close to a battle with Santa Anna and the Mexican army. Santa Anna sent a letter to General Taylor encouraging the surrender of the U.S. Army. And Zach Taylor responded, quote, "In reply to your note of this date, summoning me to surrender my forces at your direction, I beg leave to say that I decline acceding to your request." So there was fighting here, Agua Nueva, and a lot of Americans were getting killed. 673 casualties killed and wounded, 1,500 desertions. Jefferson Davis was wounded at this battle. There were 50 supply wagons arrived, so this was good news. And the Mexicans retreated, and the U.S. took Agua Nueva. Tough battle. February of 1847, historian and biographer K. Jack Bauer wrote about Taylor, quote, "The men loved the relaxed, unprepossessing Taylor. His appearance calmed the command group, and through them helped stabilize the troops." By February of 1847, the major battle in the war was fought at Buena Vista, and the Mexicans had 20,000 troops. The Americans only 5,000. This was the big battle in the war, and again, Taylor was known as called him Old Rough and Ready. General Taylor, the fearless leader. He's known for his frontier bluntness and disregard for clothes. which he didn't really care to. And people were starting to compare him to George Washington and Andrew Jackson as a war hero. Meanwhile, General Winfield Scott was planning to fight in the South and take Mexico City. And he was very different. He was punctilious. He was actually a very arrogant fellow called Old Fuss and Feathers. So these were the two men sort of, you could say, vying to be the military heroes of the war. Zachary Taylor, Old Rough and Ready, and Winfield Scott, Old Fuss and Feathers. Now, in the Battle of Buena Vista, a bullet tore off Zach Taylor's one of his buttons, and another grazed his arm. During the battle at Buena Vista, U.S. against Mexicans, there was an artillery battery under Captain Braxton Bragg, and Taylor gave the order to him, "Double shot your guns and give 'em hell, Bragg." Now, that was misquoted, and the misquote was, "Give them a little more grape, Mr. Bragg." And that quote became an 1848 campaign slogan. It also became a national song, "A Little More Grape, Captain Bragg," and also a famous painting by John Cameron. Now, at the Battle of Buena Vista, Henry Clay's son, Henry Clay Jr., died. And this was the big victory in the war. The United States won that battle and they were outnumbered, 20,000 to 5,000. And General Taylor showed enormous personal courage during the fighting, and this really led to his popularity nationwide. Abraham Lincoln became a supporter. Again, Taylor was the Virginia native raised on the Kentucky frontier who owned 150 slaves in his plantations in Louisiana and in Mississippi. Abraham Lincoln had this to say about Zachary Taylor, quote, "General Taylor's battles were not distinguished for brilliant military maneuvers, but in all he seems rather to have conquered by the exercise of a sober and steady judgment." Ulysses S. Grant was at the Battle of Buena Vista, great American victory. He's had this to say about Zachary Taylor, quote, "No soldier could face either danger or responsibility more calmly than he. These are qualities more rarely found than genius or physical courage. General Taylor never wore a uniform, but dressed himself entirely for comfort. He moved about the field to see through his own eyes the situation. He was very much given to sit his horse sideways, with both feet on one side, particularly on the battlefield." So after this, Taylor spent 8 months in Monterey, and meanwhile the plan was to attack the Mexicans in the South, and that responsibility was given to Winfield Scott. So Taylor decided to go home because he had nothing to do, and he became a national idol. Holman Hamilton wrote, quote, "The soldier who had won few honors in 4 decades on active duty became the recipient of honors galore. Medals of bronze, silver, and gold, swords, scabbards, sashes, medallions were showered on him by grateful compatriots. Popular songs were dedicated to him. Girls strewed flowers in his path. Even more than his victories, the unassuming manner Zachary Taylor endeared him to American civilians while enshrining him in his comrades' hearts. And suddenly the warrior who never voted became the masses' favorite candidate for the highest office in the land." So General Zach Taylor went to his home in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, which he had named Cypress Grove, to rest and visit with his family, his wife Margaret, known as Peggy. His plantation had been run well by overseers, and Margaret, his wife, did not want him to become president. Now, during the trip from Mexico to New Orleans, Zach Taylor was on a ship, and he had the sick and wounded soldiers placed in his stateroom. And then there was a story that he took a nap one day and was found on an old mattress in front of the boilers. This is one of the things that made him a very beloved man. That he cared about other people, and see, he had these guys in his own room because they were sick and wounded and needed help, and so he was a very, very good. So you can see how much he cared about other people, and this made him very popular, and actually contrasted with Winfield Scott, who was a very selfish and arrogant man. There was the two parties at the time, political parties, the Whigs and the Democrats, and the Whigs proposed that Taylor should become president. In 1848, Taylor responded, said, quote, "Stop your nonsense and drink your whiskey." Daniel Webster had this to say about Zachary Taylor. He called him, quote, "a swearing, whiskey-drinking, fighting frontier colonel." Now, he actually was nominated by the Whigs for president in 1848, and they sent him a letter that he'd been nominated, but it sat for 1 month unanswered in the Baton Rouge, Louisiana post office, because Taylor's policy was to refuse to accept letters that had postage due. In other words, you had to pay to pick up certain letters that were apparently the postage sufficient postage hadn't been placed, so he didn't answer it because it was just sitting there. So they waited a long time for his acceptance. Apparently, he finally got the letter and did accept the nomination for president. And Taylor said this, quote, "I look upon war at all times and under all circumstances as a national calamity, to be avoided at all times, if compatible with national honor." Now, he'd seen the horrors of war, and was against war if it could be avoided. Again, he wore old clothes a lot, so a lot of times people didn't recognize him. One officer said, quote, "Zachary Taylor looks more like an old farmer going to market with eggs to sell." Another description was that Zach Taylor wore, quote, "a dusty green coat, a frightful pair of trousers, and on horseback he looks like a toad." He had a legendary lack of pretension. He was a down-to-earth guy, didn't act like he was great, didn't have a sense of greatness. He was just a regular guy. It was written that he was, quote, "perfectly unaffected by his brilliant successes." Another description was that Zachary Taylor was, quote, "plain and unassuming in his kind manners, mild and affable in his disposition, and kind and courteous in his demeanor. You feel at once comfortable and easy in his society. He paid me a visit the other day. I was sitting on a trunk, writing at the time. I rose and offered him my seat, remarking that I had but a poor seat to offer him. 'Oh, never mind,' said he. 'All I am afraid of is that I will spoil the trunk.'" So at the Whig National Convention in Philadelphia in June, Zachary Taylor was nominated for president, and his vice presidential the nominee was Millard Fillmore. The Democrats, their nominee was Lewis Cass, and then there was a third party, the Free Soil Party, which was anti-slavery, and Martin Van Buren was nominated by them, the former president. In the election, Zachary Taylor received 1.4 million votes, Cass 1.2 million, and Taylor won. He received 163 electoral votes, Cass 127. This was the first election where all the states voted on the same day. And Taylor voted, and this is the first time he had voted in his entire life. He'd never voted before. Backing up a little bit, in April, Taylor declared himself a Whig. People didn't know which party he was in. And he won the nomination ahead of Henry Clay, of course, whose son had died in the war. And again, Millard Fillmore, the vice president, who was an experienced Whig. Taylor didn't have political experience. At the Democratic convention, also in Baltimore, Lewis Cass for president, William Butler vice president. And again, Taylor won the election. Historian K. Jack Bauer wrote, quote, "The general truly did not care whether or not he was elected president." Zach Taylor said in 1848, quote, "The subject of farming is one to which I have devoted much of my life, and in which I yet continue to take the deepest interest." And so, aside from the military, he had a farm, and this was important to him. Zachary Taylor had a strong record of demanding fair treatment for Indians. Of course, much of his military career was spent fighting Indians, but again, he believed that, when the fighting is over, you treat these people right. And he believed he was very much in favor of enforcing treaty rights. Historian Michael Holt called Zachary Taylor, quote, "a new Cincinnatus, a man who, like Washington, stood above party, a man without personal ambition, dedicated to the common good, a man who indeed might be able to restore the glories of the early republic. For Cincinnatus was the ancient Roman general who had given up his power and gone home. And see, the thing people liked about Zachary Taylor was his character. He was obviously a very brave man. He was an effective military leader, but he was a good man, and people could sense that he was a very good man, like George Washington. So, Zachary Taylor was elected as the 12th U.S. president. Like William Henry Harrison, the Whigs again had nominated a war hero, Harrison in 1840 and Taylor in 1848. K. Jack Bauer wrote, quote, Zachary Taylor's devotion to the preservation of the Union. Whether the attachment arose from his Army service or from an even deeper conviction is irrelevant. It existed and came to be the driving principle of the administration. See, the thing is, in 1848, the slavery question was becoming a bigger and bigger problem, more and more divisive. The anti-slavery forces, the abolitionist movement was growing stronger, and the resistance to that was growing strong. So more and more conflict between North and South, the free states in the North and the slave states in the South, and the possibility of the country breaking up. And Zachary Taylor was very much in favor of union and saw the vital importance of keeping the country together, if possible. December of 1848, his daughter Betty married Colonel William Bliss, who was his aide. Both were needed in the White House, Bliss as an aide and Betty as a hostess, since his wife Margaret, or Peggy, didn't want to serve as First Lady. She lived quietly upstairs in the White House and only entertained friends and relatives. She had made a bargain with God that if Zachary Taylor returned safe, her husband, from Mexico, she would eschew public appearances. Taylor named John Clayton his Secretary of State. In January of 1849, he traveled to Washington, D.C. for his inauguration. Now, his wife, Peggy, she had prayed that he would lose the election. It was a long, tough trip from his home in Louisiana to Washington. He traveled on the Mississippi River on a steamboat from Baton Rouge to Cincinnati. And then by the time he got there, Cincinnati, the Ohio River was frozen, so they couldn't continue. He took a sleigh to Wheeling, West Virginia. And part of that trip, he traveled from Cypress Grove to Vicksburg, backing up on a packet, or on a boat, named Saladin. Saladin, who was the great ancient Muslim leader from the Crusades, who had defended the Holy Land and Jerusalem against the Christian Crusaders led by Richard the Lionheart. So Taylor continued on by sleigh and coach from Cumberland, Maryland to Baltimore and on to Washington, D.C., arriving in February of 1849. He was 64 years old and really tired. Well, that concludes today's presentation. We'll finish up next time with part 3, the 16 months of Zachary Taylor's presidency, which were also the last 16 months of his life. I hope you find a good history book to read if you don't have one. There's so many out there. You might consider checking out our website, Adventures in History with Peter J. Ray, at peterjray.com. So far, we've made 599 history videos. So today's video is our 600th. Yay! We've made history videos in 7 areas: world history, American history, book reviews, poetic tours, Cleveland baseball, family history, and autobiography. You also might consider checking out our podcast, Adventures in History. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. God bless you. Take care. And I'll see you next time.